Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments. I'm sitting here at 3 in the morning. I am unable to sleep, so I am writing this. In all honesty, I doubt I'll ever have the same perspective on my driveway. 3 weeks ago, I was just another 28-year-old man living alone in my dad's former rental home in the Phoenix suburbs, doing customer service for a cable company house following his death last year. There isn't much there. The front yard is more dirt than grass, the shutters have flaking paint, and there are 2 bedrooms. Now that it's mine, though, I'm too busy making mortgage payments to give much thought to how silent it gets at night. I had been getting used to this pattern of Netflix, work, and the occasional beer with my neighbor Jeff when things didn't go as planned. It was a predictable, possibly dull life. However, now that I think about it, dull sounds really damn wonderful. Trevor knocked on my door on a Tuesday night in late October. Since we graduated from Westview, I hadn't seen the man 10 years ago. He had the same crooked smile and shaggy brown hair, but he appeared leaner than I remembered. Almost gaunt on my porch. He was dressed in jeans with holes that didn't appear to be deliberate and a worn leather jacket that had seen better days. He said, "Hey man, long time no see," as if we had only spoken yesterday, other than 10 years ago. But there was something odd about his gaze. They continued to flit about, never really looking into my eyes for longer than a second. He shifted his weight from foot to foot with a nervous energy. Furthermore, his smile failed to reach those agitated eyes. I was in the neighborhood and decided to pay a visit. "Do you mind if I enter? Right now? I could really use a friend." My first caution should have come from the way he stated it, with this undercurrent of urgency that I couldn't quite identify. After a few drinks on my couch, Trevor told me about his experience living and working in Las Vegas construction, but he needed a place to stay for a few days while he worked things out because things had gone wrong with his fiancée. He continued to check his phone every few minutes and would look tensely out the window whenever a car passed outside. Taking a long gulp of his beer, he remarked, "You know how it is, man, sometimes you simply need to step away and wait for things to calm down." He rambled about drama and people who don't know when to let things go when I inquired what kinds of things he was talking about. He seemed to be telling me a story with half the elements omitted, and there was an odd undercurrent throughout the entire talk. However, we had previously been friends and had gone to the same lunches and classes. Additionally, I suppose that because we were both still young and still figuring out who we were, I felt as though I owed him something. As we completed our 3rd drink, Trevor was already settling in, asking me where I kept the extra blankets, and throwing his old duffel bag in the corner. For a few days, I informed him the couch was his, dismissing the voice in my head that insisted that this whole thing was strange. More than just having a place to sleep, he appeared relieved, like though he was finally able to let his breath after holding it 4 weeks. He remarked, "Thanks, buddy," and his smile seemed real for a second. "I owe you one, truly. This is simply temporary, I swear." I went to bed that night feeling like I was helping an old friend, and I might have even felt a little proud of myself for being the type of person who had done someone a favor. I would have paid for the accommodation and taken him to a motel personally if I had known what was about to happen. The first few days went really smoothly, or at least that's what I told myself. For the majority of the day, Trevor would be absent. He claimed to be looking for a job and attending to business, and he would return around dinner time with groceries or takeout, always paying with cash and appearing slightly more agitated than when he had left. He said that his practice of parking his dilapidated Ford Taurus at the end of the block rather than in my driveway was simply being thoughtful enough not to block me. However, I observed that he consistently placed it so that he could see both ends of the street from the window in my living room. He would remain up late at night, with the brightness turned all the way down, to browse through his phone. I also saw him repeatedly looking through the curtains at automobiles that were moving too slowly, when he would simply shrug and respond that he was a light sleeper when asked whether everything was well. Living in the city had made him fearful of intruders. Trevor was sitting at my kitchen table when I woke up on Friday morning. He was dressed and appeared to have just gotten out of bed. His hair was disheveled, and the dark circles beneath his eyes gave him an aged, nearly haggard appearance. I hadn't even had my coffee when he remarked, "Hey, I need a huge favor. I have an appointment across town that I really can't miss, and my car is making this strange noise. May I use yours for a couple of hours?" He pointed to my 2018 Toyota Camry, which was parked in the driveway, the one dependable item I was the sole owner of. He wasn't actually asking in that manner. His words had a desperate edge that made it obvious that this was a must. "Man, it's very crucial. By midday, I'll have it back, I promise." I wanted to refuse, but the man appeared to be under a lot of stress. It also seemed petty to deny after allowing him to crash for over a week. I threw my keys to him and warned him to use caution. I watched through the glass as he adjusted the seat and mirrors as if he were getting ready for a lengthy journey. It's a long way across town. After lunch, it was 2 p.m. for 100 p.m. after that. Every time I tried to call Trevor's phone, it went straight to voicemail. That instant click to the generic message not even ringing. By nightfall, I was pacing my home, alternating between real concern and irritation. Perhaps his appointment had gone on for too long. The car might have broken down. A dozen benign explanations, perhaps. However, as the hours passed, as time went on, the nausea in my stomach intensified. I couldn't stop thinking about his behavior during the week. The cash payments, the manner he observed the street, and the evasive responses regarding his circumstances. In Vegas, approximately 10 p.m. I ultimately reported the vehicle as possibly stolen to my insurance provider, but I felt absurd to do so. I hesitated when the agent asked if I wanted to report something to the police. I thought Trevor was going to be my friend. By midnight, however, with no word and my car gone, I was beginning to consider the idea that I had been duped from the start. I slept that night, gazing out the window as if Trevor may suddenly pull up and say he was sorry for being late, and checking my phone every few minutes. I told myself I was being thorough rather than neurotic. I spent the most of Saturday morning, which dragged by with no news, visiting nearby hospitals, and even looking up jail records online. I heard the familiar sound of my Camry's engine driving into the driveway that evening, while I was enjoying a beer on my couch and debating whether to formally report the car stolen. I felt so relieved that I felt lightheaded. Trevor had returned, most likely with a wild tale about getting lost or his phone dying. I was prepared to lash out at him for worrying me, so I made my way to the front door. However, my relief changed when I peered through the peephole. Misunderstanding. Even though the sun was fading, Trevor was stepping out of the driver's seat with a woman I had never seen before. She was tall, blonde, and wearing heavy shades. Both of them were anxiously scanning their surroundings, and Trevor kept turning to look back at the street as if someone were pursuing them. Before they could knock, I opened the door, and without warning, Trevor's demeanor changed to one of forced casualness that was unflattering. "Hey buddy, I apologize for being late," he remarked, as if being away for more than 24 hours was a small annoyance. "This is Amanda, my Vegas-based friend. She came by car to assist me with a few things." Trevor was talking quickly, explaining something about car trouble and having to wait for parts, but I wasn't really listening because I was too busy looking around the neighborhood. Amanda, who had a sharp, angular face and moved with the nervous energy that made me think of a cat ready to bolt, barely acknowledged me, nodded once, and continued scanning the neighborhood behind those dark glasses, observing additional details, such as the fact that Amanda kept one hand in her huge purse, that they both appeared to have gone days without taking a shower, and that plastic bags and what appeared to be camping equipment had now taken up the back seat of my car. "We just need to grab my stuff, and we'll be out of your hair," Trevor remarked, heading for the house without waiting for an invitation. "Thanks for being so cool about everything, man. You truly save lives." However, I no longer felt cool about anything. I smelled something sharp and metallic as they passed me on their way into my house, like burnt rubber combined with an unidentified substance. Without saying anything, Amanda immediately went to the restroom, and I heard her lock the door behind her. With trembling hands, Trevor was packing his things into his duffel bag more quickly than was necessary. He merely muttered something about managing business in Tucson. When I inquired where they had been, my attention was drawn to the scratches on his knuckles and what appeared to be a tiny cut on his cheek, which had not been there when he departed. He paused a fraction of a second too long when I extended my hand for my car keys, which were still in his pocket. "Yeah, of course," he answered, letting them fall into my hand at last. "Once again, thank you for lending it to me. It really saved my ass." I realized I didn't want to know why the keys were warm and sticky. There was a serious problem here, and my gut told me to get these people out of my house as soon as possible. When I woke up on Sunday morning, I heard car doors slamming and engines starting, and I watched Trevor and Amanda drive away in his Ford Taurus through my bedroom window, leaving only tire marks and the smell of fear and cigarettes. Despite Trevor's claims that he had only driven across town, I discovered a crumpled receipt in my driveway from a gas station in Flagstaff, which was 3 hours north of home, and instead of feeling relieved, I spent the morning walking around my house, noticing things that were off, like how they had left the bathroom window cracked open, how many footprints had been tracked through my kitchen that were definitely not mine, and how my car now had an almost empty gas tank. I checked my car more carefully and found a small dent in the rear bumper and what appeared to be blue paint transfer that matched the color of police cruisers. Phoenix, and nowhere near where he'd said he was going. Monday morning at 7:30 a.m., and my hands were shaking as I stood in my driveway, piecing together pieces of a puzzle I desperately didn't want to solve. As I was making coffee in my kitchen, I noticed 3 police cars approaching my house through the window, their lights flashing but without sirens. At first, I assumed that one of my neighbors had been harmed, but then Detective Lisa Morrison, "We have reason to believe you may have unknowingly assisted a fugitive," she said when she knocked on my door with my badge in hand, asking if I knew Trevor Jameson and when I'd last seen him. She also revealed that my car had been seen on security cameras at 2 separate crime scenes over the weekend, one at a gas station in Sedona and another at a convenience store in Flagstaff, and that Trevor was wanted in connection with an armed robbery in Las Vegas 2 weeks prior. Stated, all of a sudden, everything fit together like the scariest jigsaw puzzle in the world. I filled them in on everything, including Trevor's unexpected appearance, his apprehensive demeanor, borrowing my car, Amanda, and everything else. They informed me I would have to come down to the station for a formal statement and confiscated my Camry for evidence. I became aware that my dull, routine existence had just been turned into evidence in a criminal inquiry as I watched them put my car onto a tow truck, and I had never been so appreciative to be viewed as a victim instead of an accomplice. I still can't sleep because of something that happened last spring when I was 17 and living in Cedar Falls with my aunt, Catherine. After what seemed to be the longest winter of my life, the weather had just begun to warm up in late March, just before Easter break. I was a junior at Westfield at the time. I'm high and spend the most of my free time with Brooklyn, Vanessa, and Chloe, my 3 best friends, because we were the oddball students who liked horror films and ghost stories more than the usual teenage drama. We had a strong bond and had known each other since middle school. The previous year, My parents had relocated to Denver for work, leaving me with Aunt Catherine, who was, quite honestly, the most awesome guardian a teenager could wish for. She was a night shift worker at the nearby hospital, making our home the unofficial meeting place for late-night movie marathons and weekend sleepovers. Brooklyn had recently acquired this old Victorian home from her great-aunt Millicent, who had died in February, which is how it all began. The mansion seemed like it belonged in a Gothic novel, set against a backdrop of tall oak trees and overgrown hedges on the outskirts of town. Although Brooklyn's parents intended to sell it, they had allowed her to browse through the possessions first to determine what was valuable. We had driven past it innumerable times, each daring the other to slip onto the property, but none of us had been inside yet. Rumors circulated that old Millicent had been involved in some really bizarre activities prior to her passing, and the neighbors muttered about strange noises emanating from the basement at night. When Brooklyn recommended that we explore the area on Friday night, it seemed like the ideal chance for an adventure. We all yearned for something thrilling, something that would provide us with tales to reminisce about 4 years to come. We prepared the typical sleepover supplies, sleeping bags, food, and of course, Chloe's camera gear, because she was so focused on recording everything for her YouTube channel that Friday night. The plan was straightforward: get together at my house at approximately 7, have dinner, and then go to the house when it gets dark. Earlier that week, Brooklyn's parents had given her the keys with a strict warning to be careful and not stay too late. However, in all honesty, we were 17 years old and unbeatable in that foolish manner of teens. Furthermore, the cautions only added to the excitement of the situation. It was about 9:00 p.m. when we arrived to the residence. The smell was the first thing that struck us. Even before we opened the car doors, there was a strong, musty smell that appeared to permeate the glass. It resembled a mixture of rotten and delicious earth, the sort of scent that clings to your throat and wrinkles your nose. Brooklyn simply laughed and said it was probably just old wood and mildew from being closed 4 months, but Vanessa started complaining about it right away. Up close, the home appeared much more massive than it had from the street. Boarded up, windows on the second level, 3 stories of dark wood and peeling paint, and a wraparound porch that drooped from years of neglect. The front door was a huge oak object with elaborate carvings that had a Celtic appearance. Unlike something from a horror film, it moaned open when Brooklyn turned the key. The interior was just as we had anticipated. Family portraits with eyes that seemed to watch you, dusty furniture wrapped in white linen, with that same overpowering stench of deterioration and desolation. We basically wandered around the main floor for the first hour, shooting everything and making jokes to hide the fact that we were all a little spooked. Dishes were still in the sink in the kitchen, as if Millicent had just left for a moment later. The living room was crammed with odd relics, crystals, books with titles in languages none of us knew, and dried plants hanging from the ceiling. However, Chloe brought up the basement door first. There are at least 3 locks on this massive wooden object that is hidden beneath the main staircase. Although Brooklyn brought an entire ring of keys, it took over 20 minutes to determine which ones unlocked the basement locks. As we worked on the door, the scent grew worse, and by the time we managed to open it, Vanessa was already discussing the possibility of ending the evening. But now that we could see those steep wooden stairs vanishing into total darkness below, the rest of us were too intrigued to turn back. None of us had anticipated the size of the basement, with everything felt claustrophobic because of the low arched ceilings in the core area that was surrounded by several rooms. Every time we moved, these strange shadows danced across the walls, created by our phone flashlights just breaking through the darkness. There was more of Millicent's collection in the main room, jars of preserved items that we were unable to recognize. In every corner were what appeared to be altars or shrines, along with more books. However, what truly drew our attention was the little room at the back. the one with the entirely black painted door that has deep carved symbols in the wood. The first thing we noticed when we eventually opened the door was how much warmer the interior was. Even though we hadn't seen any radiators or vents, it seemed as though the space had its own heating system. These elaborate carvings spiraled from floor to ceiling, covering the walls. Images and symbols that were painful to look at directly, and appeared to change when you weren't paying attention to them. There was a circular, about 4-foot tall stone platform in the middle of the room, wide, with tiny holes around the borders caused by channels etched into its surface. Candle stubs were scattered around the edge, and something dark had soaked into the stone over time, discoloring the entire structure. Strange shapes formed as their wax melted and tugged. Chloe was shooting everything, asking Brooklyn if her great-aunt had ever mentioned anything, and taking close-ups of the sculptures. Regarding this room, Brooklyn simply said that she had never heard of any of this before and shook her head in disbelief. Like the moments before a thunderstorm, the air within felt heavy and charged. We all observed that our phones were constantly malfunctioning. The flashlight and camera would both freeze, would flash, and the battery levels continued to fluctuate erratically. Vanessa became rather uneasy at that point and suggested that we go back upstairs and perhaps return later in the day when we would have a better view. Now that she was certain she had discovered something that would make her channel famous, Chloe was in full documentary mode and insisted that we stay longer and do more exploring. Brooklyn, mumbling that her parents had never brought up any of this when they handed her the keys, ran her fingertips down the etched walls, caught between interest and uneasiness. We all began taking off our sweaters and jackets as the room's temperature seemed to keep rising, yet something about the warmth felt off. It was something that came from inside your skin, not like ordinary heat. At around midnight, we detected our first noise coming from the upper floor. Only careful, unhurried footfall moved across the main floor above us. We all fell silent and strained to hear, but the noises ceased just as abruptly as they had begun. The footfall had been too deliberate and rhythmic to be random creaking, but Chloe instantly assumed it was just the ancient house settling. That's when the argument began, with Chloe requesting that we stay to look into it, and Vanessa insisting that we go right away. Although it sounded rational at the time, the compromise we came to was likely the worst choice any of us had ever made. Chloe declared that she would spend the night nonetheless, determined to dispel the rumors and document any ghostly activity. Because of this possibility, she had taken a sleeping bag, and her decision was already made. Not reluctant to leave, Chloe alone, Vanessa, and Brooklyn made the decision to stay as well. However, they preferred to camp in the main basement space as opposed to the carved room. I ought to have demanded that we all go together. I should have believed the nausea that had been developing in my stomach ever since that black door had been opened. Rather, I consented to stay, in part out of loyalty and in part because I was interested. Over the course of the following hour, we moved our belongings downstairs and set up our sleeping bags in a circle close to the bottom of the basement stairs, far enough away from the carved room to prevent us from feeling the strange heat. We sat down to wait while Chloe positioned her tripod-mounted camera facing the black door. Around 1 a.m., the footsteps upstairs resumed, increasingly often these days, occasionally accompanied by the sound of furniture being moved. However, teenage pride is a strong thing, and we were dedicated to our scheme. Even now, I still don't fully understand what transpired next. Around 2 a.m., at the same time, we all began to feel extremely sleepy, as if someone had secretly given us sleeping pills. We were nervously giggling and whispering 1 minute, and then I was having trouble keeping my eyes open. Within minutes, Vanessa, who had fallen asleep first, was curled up in her sleeping bag and taking deep breaths. Brooklyn came shortly after, and I recall resisting the strong impulse to simply close my eyes before I passed off. The last thing I noticed was Chloe, still sitting upright with her camera, muttering something about how strange it was that we were all so exhausted. Sunlight was pouring in through the little basement windows when I woke up, and I felt as though I had been sleeping on concrete for a week. I had a dry mouth, my mind was racing, and my tongue had a metallic flavor that made me think of blood. Brooklyn and Vanessa were still dozing off in their suitcases. However, Chloe's sleeping bag was empty as I turned to face her. Chloe was not there, but her camera remained on the tripod, still aiming toward that black door. After I roused Brooklyn and Vanessa, we spent the next 20 minutes looking all throughout the basement and calling Chloe's name. Her clothing and phone were still in her sleeping bag. Her shoes, but she simply vanished. The carved room was just as we had left it, with the exception that the air had returned to its usual warmth, and that some of the candle stubs surrounding the stone platform appeared to have been lit lately. Wax droplets that hadn't been there the previous evening were now present. We looked at the stairs in the basement, assuming she had gone upstairs to use the restroom, but just as we had left it, the massive door at the top remained shut from the inside. Without the key, which Brooklyn still held in her pocket, she could not have physically escaped in that manner. At that point, we became quite anxious and called her parents and the police to try to explain how our friend had disappeared overnight from a closed basement. At first, the responding police officers were dubious, obviously believing we were merely feigning adolescent drama. Their attitudes, however, dramatically altered when they conducted their own investigation of the house and were unable to locate any other means of leaving the basement. They came in crime scene investigators, search dogs, and everything else. However, they were forced to acknowledge that they had no idea what had happened to Chloe after 3 days of intense searching. Weeks passed throughout the investigation, but ultimately the case was abandoned. Chloe's parents brought in a psychic who said the house had bad energy, hired private investigators, and posted missing person posters across the community. Brooklyn's parents listed the house for sale right away. However, nobody wanted to purchase it after everything that transpired. I occasionally pass by the deserted house, constantly wondering what actually transpired. Evening, the three of us, who were present, Brooklyn, Vanessa, and myself, no longer discuss it. For some time, we attempted to make sense of things by comparing our memories, but it only increased our level of anxiety and paranoia. We will likely never see each other again after our graduation next month, which is probably for the best. The thing that really bothers me, though, is this. I haven't disclosed this information to anyone before. Later, when we watched Chloe's camera footage in an attempt to piece together what had transpired, the last thing we saw was her approaching the carved chamber at around 3 in the morning. She moved slowly, as though she were walking while you're asleep, and she turned and stared straight at the camera's lens before vanishing into the darkness outside its field of view. Her mouth moved as if she were speaking, but her face was entirely expressionless. Despite playing it back numerous times, we were never able to discern the words. The Chloe was never seen again when the camera abruptly stopped recording. It's a common misconception that you can always tell when something is amiss. It can sometimes hit you in chunks, and by the time you realize what you're involved in, it's too late to turn back. I was living alone at the time in a little duplex outside of Louisville, Kentucky. At a printing plant, I worked nights and mainly stayed away from myself. With the exception of my older brother Caleb, I didn't have a close relationship with my family. He was 2 years my senior and a little crazy as a child, but we had always supported one another. He had the ability to simultaneously create a cozy and chaotic atmosphere in a space, among those with the ability to talk their way out of any situation. And he made an effort that evening. My phone came up at about 2:20 in the morning. I simply sat down on the couch with a blanket from the previous evening still partially folded and microwaved some leftover wings, so I can recall the precise moment. I picked up as soon as Caleb's name appeared, expecting something stupid, inebriated, or both, The first sound I heard, though, was breathing. Uneven, shaky, nothing like him. Then he continued, "I need you to tell the police that I spent the entire night with you. Just that. No hello. No joking." I chuckled, assuming he had gotten into problems in a bar once more, but it was some strange practical joke. He didn't laugh back, though. He spoke in a strained tone. "Have faith in me. Let's say I spent tonight at your house. You must say that for me." I didn't inquire as to why. I simply said, yes. I was still looking at my phone 5 minutes later when I noticed the blue and red flash through the closed shutters. Outside Caleb's apartment, a police car was parked. 3 blocks away was where he resided. It began to feel off at that point. It was crisp, like if I had suddenly become overly aware of everything, but not frightening yet. The buzzing street, light outside, the creak of my refrigerator, and the reality that it had been more than a week since I had last seen Caleb. I watched the automobile from the front window. 2 policemen exited. While one stood close to the trunk of Caleb's car, which was parked awkwardly along the curb. The other was hammering on his door. The vehicle continued to operate. A few minutes later, the engine died. I never saw Caleb, so I'm not sure if he was inside or not. The officers just stayed for 10 minutes or so before leaving in their car. I believed it to be the case. I assumed that he was afraid of things getting worse after a bar fight or even a DUI scare. That night, I didn't get much sleep. I was knocked on my door the following day. 2 detectives, dressed simply, forceful but courteous. They wanted to know if I had spent the previous evening with my brother. They glanced at each other, and I replied, yeah, he'd been at my place all evening, just like he asked me to. I stuttered when one of them inquired, what time did he leave? I hadn't given it much thought. Around midnight, I said something. They thanked me, nodded, and walked away. Without exerting any force, but as soon as the door closed, my heart truly began to race. I reached for my phone and attempted to contact Caleb. No response. I texted. They arrived at my house. What's happening? Nothing. The whole day was spent in silence. Approximately 6 p.m. to go to his residence on foot. His car remained in the same location as the previous evening, but this time the trunk was locked and closed. I knocked. No answer. I opened the door. When he got locked out once a year ago, he gave me a spare key. The flat was clean, almost clean and quiet. His phone was charging on the counter, but there were no dishes in the sink or jackets at the door. Missed calls, including mine, filled the screen. For a long time, he stood there looking at his phone, trying to determine which felt worse. The fact that he obviously didn't want to chat, or that he hadn't brought it with him. I strolled into his bedroom through the hallway, past the partially open bathroom door. There appeared to be no disturbances. Closed closet, bed made. However, I recall pausing at the dresser. We were photographed at our grandmother's old camper when we were young. They had shifted it. He turned around as if he no longer wanted to see it, not just the dust. I began to sense something different at that point. Don't freak out just yet. I had a sneaking suspicion that I had lied too soon. That perhaps I need to have inquired further before accepting. Everything exploded. The following morning, Danielle Conrad, a woman, had been reported missing. 27 resided 4 houses down on Caleb Street. Her name was mentioned in the news as if it were well known. Though I didn't, I somehow recognized her face. After some time, I recalled that she was employed part-time at the gas station close to the I worked nights in a warehouse, always chewed pink gum that smelled like strawberry chemicals, and wore those thick rings on every other finger. I had witnessed her giggling with clients, but never with staff. Not shy, but quiet, she hadn't arrived. Either took calls or went to work that morning. She still had her automobile parked in her driveway. There was no forcible entry into her home. The time frame was what tightened my chest. She has not been seen since approximately 1000 p.m. Caleb's night gave me a call. According to witnesses, she was carrying groceries inside after returning from a shift. No noise, no screams, just disappeared. In a statement, the police said they were interviewing locals and conducting a search of the area. After reading each word twice, I read it a third time. At that moment, I recalled Caleb's voice, the way it sounded, and the specificity of his words. Tell them I spent the entire night with you. No, I need assistance. I didn't make a mistake. Tell me a falsehood, please. I was sitting in my car across the street from Caleb's apartment that night, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. I hadn't heard his voice in more than 36 hours, even though his car was still sitting outside. This time something was different. There appeared to be hardened dirt streaks on the rear bumper, as though a vehicle had passed through a field or a ditch. Cleaning his car was something Caleb detested. When a single leaf adhered to the windshield, he used to complain. The trunk caught my attention. I just couldn't get it out of my head. The picture of him standing there the night he phoned me, hastily closing it, his face white in the dark, kept coming to mind even though I knew it was closed. I didn't recognize the number that called me the following morning. Caleb was the one. It sounded as though he hadn't had any sleep. Do not ask me any questions, I said. It's not you. I will be gone for some time. Ignore it. Where was he? I asked. He ended the call. His voice was gone from my ears after that. 2 towns over, in a drainage tunnel behind an abandoned storage lot, the authorities discovered Danielle's remains 3 days later. Only that it was a suspicious death, and that they were investigating people of interest were made public. Caleb's automobile had been seized for evidence, and his flat had been searched. I didn't disclose regarding the call. He hadn't gotten in touch with me since that evening. I informed them. It wasn't all at once when the remorse struck. It came in waves, usually in the middle of the night when a siren sounded in the distance or the home creaked. I couldn't stop thinking about the trunk and how quickly I responded yes without understanding what I was hiding. The thing that frightens me the most is how effortlessly I told the lie when the detectives knocked, as if I had practiced it. In order to avoid driving by that block, I started to avoid the neighborhood and even switched shifts at work. I would check the internet every few months to see whether Caleb's name was mentioned. It hasn't. It seems as though he vanished, and Danielle is no longer discussed. I still harbor the suspicion that I misinterpreted everything and that Caleb did nothing at all, just a horrible coincidence. Then his voice comes back to me. His voice, not his words. It was similar to someone who knew a door had just permanently closed behind him. I haven't disclosed the true events of that evening to anyone, not the girl I've been seeing for the past year, not my parents, not my co-workers. But I'm constantly thinking about it. Yes, I said. When I went outside at 1:47 a.m. that Saturday night in November 2023, the music from Murphy's Bar was still blaring in my ears. I'm a junior studying psychology at State University, and I just spent the entire evening celebrating my roommate Jessica's 21st birthday with far too many cosmic and not nearly enough food. I was so underdressed for the walk home that the November air sliced through my thin jacket. My phone's 12% battery could have been my first clue, but all I could think about was going back to my dorm room and falling into bed. Jessica had already left with a guy from her statistics class, leaving me standing on the sidewalk by myself, trying to open the Rideshare app on my phone, watching the little cars move around the map while I shivered in my mini dress and heels. The street was mostly deserted, save for a few other college students staggering toward the late-night pizza place next door. The estimated wait time was 12 minutes, which seemed like forever when you're standing alone downtown. At almost 2 in the morning, the app indicated that my driver would be in a black Honda Accord with a license plate that ended in 847, and his thoughts turned to how my psychology professor used to warn us about situational awareness and choice fatigue concepts that were so intellectual in the classroom, but felt very real. When a black sedan pulled up to the curb directly in front of me, I instinctively grabbed the door handle and slid into the back seat, relieved to be out of the cold. Michael had a 4.9 star rating, and I was looking through his reviews, reading about how friendly and on time he was. A middle-aged white man with graying hair at his temples, wearing a navy polo shirt that looked freshly pressed even at this hour, was the driver. He had kind eyes in the rearview mirror and nodded politely when I thanked him. The interior smelled like vanilla air freshener mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. "Hey, thanks for picking me up so fast," I said, fastening my seat belt as I settled into the leather seats. I verified my location and took out my phone to check the route on the app, but the screen was already dimming as my battery dropped to 8%. His voice was calm and professional, just what you'd expect from a highly rated driver. "No problem at all, miss. University dorms, right? Right." The first few minutes of the ride were completely normal, and we struck up a conversation about how busy downtown gets on weekends, and he asked if I was enjoying college. He seemed genuinely interested in my psychology major, and even mentioned that I was finally able to relax after a long night of socializing and pretending to enjoy shots that tasted like nail polish remover. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, and I leaned back against the headrest. I nearly fell asleep, lulled by the warm car and the soft hum of the engine. But then I realized we were going toward the industrial area of town rather than the usual route back to campus, so I sat up straighter and looked at my phone, trying to open the app to check our location, but the screen went black, dead. His daughter was also considering studying the same thing. "Pardon me," I began, attempting to sound informal. "I believe we may be headed in the wrong direction. The university is heading back toward the city center." Everything changed at that point. His eyes in the rearview mirror had lost their kindness. His voice had completely changed from friendly to flat and emotionless when he said, "We're taking a little detour." I tried to remain calm, telling myself that perhaps there was an accident or construction obstructing the main road, but I knew deep down that this wasn't right. "I really need to get back to campus," I said. He didn't answer, but instead he reached over and I heard a clear clicking sound. The automatic door locks engaged. "I have an early class tomorrow," coming out higher than I wanted. We were now driving through a section of town I had never seen before, past chain-link fences and empty warehouses, when the sound reverberated in the silent car like a gunshot, and the vanilla air freshener smell seemed to suddenly overwhelm, almost suffocate. I grabbed the door handle and pulled, but nothing happened. It's topped with razor wire. The only sound in the car was my own breathing, which was becoming shallower and faster by the second. I tried to think logically, recalling all I had learned in my abnormal psychology class about crisis situations and how to remain composed under pressure, but my mind was racing and I could feel panic beginning to creep up my spine. He looked at me in the mirror once more, and this time I noticed something in his face that made my whole body stiffen. "Listen, if this is about money, I can pay you extra," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "I just want to go home." The car slowed down as we came to an empty junction, and I knew we were now in a fully industrial area where there would be no witnesses or helpful miles. It wasn't rage or greed, but eagerness, as if he was enjoying this. "You kids today, you're too trusting," he remarked abruptly, his voice becoming almost conversational, which was worse than the stillness in some ways. "You simply get into any car without doing any research." I was certain he could hear my heart thumping so loudly. In my haste to escape, I assumed the first black car that appeared was mine without checking the license plate. How could I have been so foolish? I began searching wildly for anything I might use as a weapon or a way to signal for help. My palms were sweating as I tried the door handle again, pulling harder this time, but the locks held firm. The car was immaculate except for a tiny pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror, and the windows were tinted to dark for anyone outside to see in. Even if there had been anyone around to see, we turned down another deserted street, this one lined with overgrown lots and abandoned buildings. Long shadows that appeared to stretch into the automobile were cast by the sparse street lights. "Where are we going?" I asked, abandoning any pretense of politeness. My voice was shaking now, and I didn't care if he could hear how scared I was. "Please, just let me go. I will not discuss this with anyone. I'll say that you dropped me off at the appropriate location." He chuckled, but it wasn't just any laugh. There was a sound that made every hair on my arm rise up. He looked at me in the mirror once more and said, "Oh, but we're almost there." It was the sound someone makes when they know something you don't, when they have all the cards. At 2:23 a.m., the dashboard clock indicated, "Just a little further now, M." And I came to the realization that hours would pass before anyone would begin searching, even if they discovered I was absent. My worried mother gave me the emergency whistle on my keychain when I entered college, and that's when I recalled it. I knew I needed to be clever because my keys were hidden in my purse. I began carefully going through my backpack in an attempt to appear as though I was merely looking for something harmless, like lip balm. The automobile was now slowing down much more, and ahead I could make out a single flickering light above a loading dock that appeared to be an old warehouse. My entire body was urging me to do something, anything, before we came to a complete halt. When my fingers eventually located the whistle, I concealed it by wrapping my palm around it. "You appear anxious," he remarked, staring at me in the mirror. "Stop being. This will eventually come to an end." I knew I was running out of time after hearing those words, which made my veins freeze. The car turned into the warehouse parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. I took action as soon as he put the car in park, bringing the whistle to my lips and blowing as loudly as I could, the shrill sound piercing the silent night air, while simultaneously kicking the window with my heel boots, regardless of whether I shattered my ankle. "Assist! Someone assist me!" The driver whirled around, his face twisted in wrath, and ran toward the back seat, but I didn't hesitate, since I yelled in between whistle blasts. He must have hit something in his rage, because all the doors unlocked with a loud click. The whistle was still in my hand, and I continued to blow it as I ran, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear it and call for help. I threw myself out of the car and ran toward the street, my heels clicking frantically on the asphalt, and behind me I could hear him getting out of the car, shouting something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own panicked breathing. My lungs were burning and my feet were killing me in those stupid heels, but adrenaline kept me going. Then, miraculously, I saw headlights coming down the main road about 2 blocks away, and I ran straight toward them, screaming and waving my arms, not caring how crazy I looked. I could hear his footsteps behind me, but they were getting fainter as I put distance between us. It was a delivery. The driver saw me and stopped over, rolling down his window with a worried look on his face, perhaps on his way to one of the 24-hour diners across town. "Miss, are you okay? What took place?" I could hardly speak because I was crying, but I was able to inform him that someone had attempted to kidnap me and to please call 911. He grabbed his radio right away and began speaking to his dispatcher as I fell against the side of his truck and finally let myself fall apart. The black car was gone when I turned to face the warehouse again, and the entire area was deserted as if nothing had happened. The police arrived. They took my statement, searched the warehouse area, and found nothing but tire tracks in the gravel, despite my insistence that I wasn't hurt. The officer told me I'd done everything right, making noise, fighting back, and getting to safety as quickly as possible. They never caught the guy, and the real ride-share driver, Michael, arrived at the bar 20 minutes after I had already left, perplexed as to why the app indicated that my ride had the correct license plate number ending in 847, but I never even considered checking, and I later discovered that this type of thing occurs more frequently than people realize. The passenger wasn't there, and it turned out that he had been waiting while I was getting into a completely different car. That whistle is still on my keychain, and I always make sure my phone is charged before I leave, and sometimes I consider how different that night could have been if my mom hadn't been a college student. I still use ride-sharing apps, but now I'm obsessed with checking license plates and never get in a car until I've made sure the driver's name and photo match exactly. So worried about my safety. Music. It all began on a Tuesday night in late July 2019. I'm a single mother of my 16-year-old son, Tyler, and we live in a peaceful Milwaukee suburb. I was working long hours as a nurse at the nearby hospital at the time, juggling everything by myself after my divorce 2 years prior. Tyler had a friend named Ethan who had been visiting for about 6 months. He was a good kid, honor roll student, basketball player, and never really bothered me. Ethan was courteous enough, always saying yes ma'am and no ma'am, but there was something about him that I couldn't quite place my finger on. His clothes were always clean, but worn, as if they had been washed too many times, and he had a way of watching people when he thought they weren't paying attention. Not obvious, just these fleeting glances that lasted a second too long. He was tall for his age, perhaps 17, and had sandy brown hair that always looked disheveled, as if he had just run his fingers through it. The house was quiet when I walked in, which was unusual because Tyler usually had music playing or was on his PlayStation. I had just returned from a particularly brutal 12-hour shift at the hospital, where we had lost a patient that day, and I was emotionally spent, wanting nothing more than to microwave some leftover pasta and collapse on the couch with a glass of wine. Tyler's face was flushed, and Ethan kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting between me and the floor, and they both had this subdued energy about them, as if they'd been having a serious conversation. I called out his name. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter, and he came out of the living room with Ethan following him. Tyler began, his voice carrying. Ethan had a terrible argument with his parents tonight, and his dad tossed some of his belongings out on the grass. I felt a bit sad for him, because he was standing there, practically hunched over, and he wasn't weeping, but there was this defeated tone that kids use before they're going to ask for something major. Can he stay here tonight? He had a slight unkempt appearance, a slight tear near the collar on his t-shirt, a faint bruise on his forearm that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him, and a slump to his shoulders that made me think of a kicked dog. Tyler went on. He's just until things calm down at home, he said, his voice growing more assured. When Ethan finally glanced up at me, I noticed something in his rich brown eyes that made me want to say yes right away, something other than despair. He doesn't have anywhere else to go. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, obviously uncomfortable with needing to ask for help. The silence between us lasted for what seemed like an eternity, and I could hear the kitchen clock ticking loudly on the wall. It was this raw vulnerability that teenagers try so hard to hide. My instincts took over. What kind of person would I be if I turned away this kid who was obviously in need of help? Of course you can stay, I said, and I saw the relief spread across both boys' faces. Ethan's shoulders dropped as if he had been holding his. Ethan's voice was quiet, but earnest as he murmured, "Thank you so much, Mrs. Johnson," and Tyler really grinned for the first time since I had arrived home. I swear, I won't cause any problems. Most teenagers would have been more casual, maybe even a little embarrassed about needing help, but Ethan spoke like he was giving a prepared speech, every word carefully chosen. I dismissed the thought, telling myself I was overanalyzing things, because I was tired. There was something about the way he said it, so formal, so carefully polite, that struck me as strange. I put Ethan on the couch in our living room with some extra blankets and a pillow from the linen closet, because the child needed a safe place to sleep, and he thanked me again in that same overly polite way before settling in, as if he was afraid of taking up too much room. The boys spent some time together playing video games and conversing softly, their voices low. A soothing murmur in the background as I eventually finished my reheated pasta. At around 10 o'clock, I informed them both that it was time to wind down because Tyler had summer school, and I had another early shift the following morning. Ethan got up right away and began arranging the blankets, making sure everything was neat. "I'll be super quiet," he promised. "You won't even know I'm here," I said, meticulously smoothing down the couch cushions. Around 11 o'clock, I went upstairs to brush my teeth and change into my pajamas, while listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night. He said it with such earnest intensity that I felt bad for even assuming there was anything odd about his behavior. This was just a scared child trying to be the ideal house guest. The house grew quiet, save for the typical creaks and sighs that come with old houses, and I remember lying in bed, looking at the ceiling and thinking how proud I was of Tyler for wanting to help his friend. Tyler's room was right next to mine, and I could hear him moving around, probably getting ready for bed as well. True character, true compassion. I must have fallen asleep around midnight, worn out from the long day, but I was awakened at 3 in the morning by a quiet thudding sound, like someone strolling cautiously, but not quite cautiously enough. I lay there in the dark, trying to make out what I had heard, and then I heard it again, footsteps, this time, but from downstairs. Thinking that Ethan was simply getting water or using the restroom, I rolled over and attempted to go back asleep, but the footsteps continued. I told myself that it was probably just Ethan having trouble sleeping, maybe walking around to tire himself out, but they went on for what must have been 10 or 15 minutes, a slow, deliberate pattern that didn't fit someone just getting a drink of water, and it sounded like whoever was down there was moving methodically from room to room. I listened more intently, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but there was something about the rhythm of those footsteps that disturbed me, as if someone was pausing to take a long look, then continuing on, as if teenage boys do strange things sometimes. I waited for a few more minutes, my heart pounding a little faster than usual, until fatigue finally pulled me back under, and the following morning I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. However, the pattern was too intentional, too purposeful, and at around 3:30 the footsteps finally stopped, and I heard what sounded like the creaking of the couch springs as someone settled back down. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," he said with that same courteous smile. "I hope you don't mind that I made coffee." By the time they reached the kitchen, Ethan had already dressed and had obviously made a full pot. I wanted to express my gratitude for allowing me to stay. He was wearing the same clothes from the night before, but somehow they appeared freshly pressed, and his hair was combed back neatly. Tyler stumbled down a few minutes later, still in his pajamas, and clearly not fully awake yet. "Dude, you're up early," he mumbled to Ethan, who just shrugged and said he was always an early riser. I poured myself a cup of coffee and had to admit, it was perfectly brewed. Not too strong, not too weak. "I really can't tell you how much this meant to me," he said, shaking my hand as if we were concluding a business transaction, and declined my offer of cereal or toast, stating that he wasn't much of a breakfast person. He quietly and efficiently gathered his belongings and thanked me once more with that same formal politeness that had seemed strange to me the previous evening. After returning home for yet another lengthy shift in the afternoon, I began to notice problems. I could swear I had 3 20s in my wallet the previous evening when I went to take some money out to buy pizza for supper. There were just, to now, I stared at my wallet in my bedroom, trying to recall if I had spent the $20 and just forgotten about it. It was feasible. Recently, I had been so tired that I occasionally bought coffee or got lunch without giving it any thought. However, the uneasy feeling in my stomach persisted. After giving my purse a closer look, I discovered that my emergency credit card, which I saved for truly dire situations, was completely gone. As I spilled everything from my purse over the bed and looked through loose coins and receipts, my Heart began to race. There was no doubt that the card was gone. I attempted to explain it. It might have dropped somewhere. I might have left it at the medical facility. But when I thought about it, along with the missing money, a horrible hunch began to grow. Then my prescription bottles came back to me. I store them in my bathroom medicine cabinet. Not much, just some painkillers from when I injured my back a few months ago and my anxiety medicine that I take sometimes when work gets too much. With my heart pounding, I hurried to the bathroom and opened the cupboard to count the pills. The bottle of anxiety medicine was empty. I had just picked up the prescription the week prior, so I was positive there had been at least 15 pills remaining. Also absent was the painkiller. About half of the tablets were gone, but not the entire bottle. The truth of what had transpired struck me like a physical blow as I sat down hard on the edge of my bathtub. While I was sleeping a few feet away, someone had been in my home, in my personal space, stealing my belongings. And that someone was an adolescent whom I had kindly invited into my house. The actual theft was nearly as bad as the breach of trust. I had welcomed someone who had systematically plundered me while I was defenseless and unconscious, even though I had assumed they were a child in peril. The worst finding, however, was yet to be made. Our rudimentary security system captures video from cameras located throughout the home. It was a simple installation from the previous owners that I had never thought to replace. Up until that point, I had completely forgotten about it. I opened the app on my phone with shaking fingers and went back to the night before. My whole body froze at what I saw. At 3:17 a.m., Ethan was going through my residence, as seen on the infrared footage. He wasn't wandering about like a lost person or someone trying to find the restroom. He moved with purpose and calculation. I was horrified to see him methodically opened cupboards, rummaged through the mail on my counter, and searched through the drawers in my kitchen. He was seen on camera going upstairs, passing the restroom, and making his way directly to my bedroom. For what seemed like an age, he stood in my doorway, watching me sleep. He then proceeded to my dresser, meticulously selecting the items he desired from my jewelry box. He was in my room for over 20 minutes, according to the timestamp. Minutes during which I was totally ignorant. When I chose to vacuum the living room where he had slept, I found the last piece of evidence. I discovered it when I pulled the couch cushions to clean below. Carefully tucked down between the couch cushions where he had been sleeping was a kitchen knife from my own knife block. It was a severe carving of mine, knives, and it had not been fallen by mistake, but had been placed there on purpose. I was struck by the implications like a freight train. Theft wasn't the only issue here. While he was at my place, he had armed himself. I understood that he had been doing more than simply exploring and thieving when I heard those late night footsteps. He had been bracing himself for something even more dreadful. His courteous, appreciative manner had been a total lie, as the knife demonstrated. I called the police right away, gave them all the evidence I had, and filed a report. They informed me that incidents like this were growing more frequent. Teens knew that single mothers were more likely to take in a troubled child, so they especially targeted them. 3 days later, Ethan attempted to use my credit card at a petrol station and was arrested. As it happens, he had previously fallen for this exact fraud, and I was only the most recent victim. After that morning, I didn't see him again, and Tyler was sad when he discovered his alleged friend's true nature. The last thing you want is to return home to a silence that seems to deliberate after working long shifts and barely having the energy to microwave dinner. I was residing in a modest 2-bedroom home outside of Huntsville, Alabama, at the time. Since my divorce a year prior, I had been working remotely as an IT support specialist for a manufacturing company and had been spending a lot of time by myself. Unopened Amazon boxes and a partially assembled elliptical that I kept intending to use had taken up residence in the second bedroom. Not much, yet it was secure, dependable, and peaceful. Marcus, a younger co-worker, revealed that his cousin had recently split from her spouse and was looking for a place to land. He made it seem informal, as if she only required a short-term arrangement for a few weeks, stated that Jenna was her name. He told me that she was laid back, tidy, and only needed some time to get used to things after I asked a few standard questions about her age, employment, and whether or not she had pets. I paused. I don't like to invite people into my personal space, but Marcus had always been kind, and I was a little uncomfortable when he mentioned that she had experienced a lot of hardship. I instructed him to provide my number to her. That same evening, Jenna sent a really courteous text message with perfect punctuation, stated that she would not be a burden, was appreciative, and even help with shopping if I so desired. We decided to move in that weekend. It was just her and 2 suitcases when she arrived. Despite the heat, she wore a heavy, oversized jacket and had dark blonde hair done in a loose braid, making her appear younger than I had anticipated, possibly in her early 30s. When she entered, her eyes swept the corridor, not so much out of curiosity as intently as if she were silently cataloguing items. After a quick tour, she quietly closed the door behind her and vanished into the spare room, saying thank you multiple times. The first week was typical, perhaps a bit too quiet, but I attributed it to her dealing with emotional issues. She was alone and seldom showed up in the mornings. Before, I never invited anyone over while logging on for work, though nothing concerning. Occasionally, I would hear her moving about late at night or the microwave whirring at strange hours. If anything, I was glad she wasn't noisy or untidy. Then little things began to change. I had lost a pair of scissors I usually kept in the rubbish drawer. My bathroom's half-empty shampoo bottle was swapped out for a fresh one. I hadn't purchased it, but it was the same brand. The college coffee mug I loved the most, the one with the chip rim, was gone. I initially believed I was simply losing things, perhaps stress. I didn't start taking mental notes until I opened my refrigerator one night and saw that the jar of leftover chili, had explicitly scheduled for lunch the next day, was totally gone. I made a sandwich and ignored it because I didn't want to accuse her of anything before I was certain. However, when I returned home a few days later, the hallway closet's light was on and the ceiling's attic hatch was slightly open. I was genuinely surprised by that one. It had been more than a year since I had touched that hatch, and I most certainly wouldn't have left it in that state. The following morning, I questioned Jenna about it. After blinking at me, she came back to her room and remarked, "Oh, I didn't even know there was an attic." She didn't inquire about it, but her tone was informal, didn't appear interested at all. I was more annoyed by it than by the hatch itself. When I passed her room a few nights later, I saw that her door was slightly ajar. The light was on, and I heard a faint whispering sound that wasn't music or a video. I halted, and it stopped. I assumed she was on the phone and continued to move in an attempt to avoid being that person who eavesdrops in his own hallway. However, I saw something strange on the kitchen table the following morning. A picture. One of my relatives was involved. Maybe 2 years ago, my sister, niece, and I were photographed at a pumpkin patch. The previous evening, it hadn't been there, and I most certainly hadn't extinguished it. I stored all of my old pictures in a plastic container in the closet in the hall. The edge of this one was slightly smudged, as if it had been touched by wet hands. Without a word, I returned it to the bin. When I got home from work 2 days later, Jenna was seated at the dining table, staring at her phone. When I entered, she turned it face down like a reflex. I said, "Hey," she replied. "Hey, normal stuff." However, she left the phone in the kitchen. As she got up to depart, I looked at the screen, but I'm not sure what happened to me. Notifications continued to appear, and there was a thumbnail of the same picture of the pumpkin patch, as plain as day. Next came a picture of my parents' property, followed by a picture of my high school graduation celebration. I didn't post these on social media. None of them had ever been scanned or posted by me. My throat became parched. I gave the screen a tap. It was only her gallery on the app. They were stored and preserved. I attempted to be normal when she returned to the room, but I was unable to maintain a steady voice. "Why do you have photos of my family on your phone?" I asked her directly, and Jenna blinked, as if she hadn't first heard me. "I don't. What are you talking about?" she asked slowly after that. I took up the phone and swiveled it in her direction. The screen was locked. I hit the power switch. It requested a passcode. She simply looked at me and said, "I think you're tired. You've been working a lot." That was all she said without reaching for it. She entered her room and shut the door after leaving. I didn't get much sleep that night. Everything seemed louder, including the distant hums from the refrigerator, the creaking floors, and even the wind rustling the windows. Approximately 3 in the morning, I stood up and moved into the corridor, even though her door was still closed and there was no light underneath. I saw something that made me halt. Once more, the attic hatch was open, but this time it was broader. Trying to decide whether to be bold or clever, I stood there looking, up at the dark square. I didn't pick either. I retreated inside, put a chair under the knob, locked the door, and entered the room. That may sound paranoid, but I don't care. While someone who had misled me about family photos lived down the hall, I had no intention of exploring my own attic in the middle of the night. She had already left by the following morning, going more than just for coffee. Gone. Half of her room was deserted. They stripped the bed. There was one missing suitcase. It was ajar on the closet door. There were also some items inside that she obviously didn't care about. A flip-flop pair, an empty tote bag, and a soiled hoodie. I discovered a folded piece of notebook paper in the dresser's top drawer. Just one sentence in sloppy handwriting, with no name or message. "You failed to lock it quickly enough." I had no idea what that meant. Don't yet. When she was gone, I looked in the attic. My phone light was trembling in my fingers as I clambered up. It appeared as though she had been spending time indoors, because there were candy wrappers, a throw blanket, and one of my old hoodies up there. I don't know for how long. I gave Marcus a call. He shared my astonishment, claimed it had been more than a year since he had spoken to Jenna, not since she became strange during the divorce. He became silent after I told him everything, and then he remarked, "Dude, her name isn't Jenna." I asked him what he meant when he said, "Her real name is Emily. Jenna was the ex-wife." He clarified that the cousin's ex had begun using her identity online following their split. She stated that she didn't want her ex-husband to find her, and that she wanted a new beginning. That's what she would when Marcus's aunt contacted her last year. She was informed. Claimed to have had a horrific event. Nobody was certain of what. She simply hopped around, never staying in one spot for too long. In the same day, I changed the locks. The following day, cameras were placed throughout the residence. That spare room is no longer in use by me. I don't store anything there, and I keep the door closed. I still check the attic hatch every night before I go to bed, just in case, but nothing has disappeared since and no odd pictures have surfaced. While I was working in the field, I never discovered how she obtained those photos or what else she had done. Another room. I only know that I opened the door for someone I didn't truly know. She also didn't simply move in, like she had been waiting for someone to leave a door open. She settled in as if she had always been there. Music. When I inherited my grandmother's Victorian home 5 years ago, I didn't exactly envision myself running a bed and breakfast in a little Maine town. Since my divorce, I had been running the Willowbrook Inn, primarily alone at the age of 34, and attempting to keep it afloat with weekend visitors and the odd business traveller. The majority of the days were predictable: continental breakfast, clean sheets, and courteous small conversation with visitors who would depart on Sunday. That was before everything changed in September 2021, after a specific visitor entered my front door on a muggy Thursday night. With a soft-spoken courtesy that instantly calmed me, Helen Carpenter introduced herself, carrying only a battered leather duffel bag and enough cash to cover 3 months in advance. With grained brown hair pulled back in a stylish bun and elegant, yet modest clothing, she looked to be in her late 40s, the type of woman you can anticipate seeing them providing piano lessons or volunteering at a library. She clarified that she wanted a peaceful place to stay while she considered her options, because she was going through a challenging time of transition. Her deliberate pauses between sentences gave the impression that she had experienced a horrific event but was attempting to remain composed. She put $3,600 on my reception desk in neat hundreds. After 12 weeks of requesting the second floor corner room, I immediately said yes. Since business had been poor, the fixed revenue was exactly what I needed to pay for the roof repairs that were coming up. Helen and I had a pleasantly uneventful first few weeks together. She rarely left room 7, with the exception of quick trips to the kitchen to prepare tea at midnight. Years earlier, I had placed a tiny kitchenette on each floor, and she appeared to like the seclusion it provided. I could hear the faint sound of classical music coming from her chamber during the day. It was always the same piece, a gloomy one, that I couldn't quite place. She never sat on the wraparound porch like other guests, never ate the continental meal I made, and she never even inquired about local points of interest. The only signs of her existence were the quiet footsteps that occasionally echoed above the ceiling of my first floor apartment and the courteous nods she gave us when we passed each other in the hallway. She never fully met my gaze with her light blue eyes when weekend visitors began to arrive for the holidays in early December. Everything began to change. It was a Boston retired couple in the Hendersons who first pointed out something out of the ordinary. Mrs. Henderson, whose normally upbeat manner was replaced with obvious distress, came up to me Saturday morning and was placing fresh flowers. In the lobby, she whispered about hearing what sounded like a conversation between 2 people at 3 in the morning from the room next to theirs, room 7, individuals, but she had only ever witnessed Helen entering and exiting. Mrs. Henderson firmly shook her head when I suggested that it might have been the television. She said that she had heard different voices, having what sounded like an argument, with Helen's kind tone being sometimes broken by something much harsher and more intense. According to her, the talk lasted about an hour before it ended suddenly, with the sound of a heavy object being pulled across the floor. With seasoned hospitality, I downplayed Mrs. Henderson's worries, pointing them that Helen was most likely simply watching late-night movies, and that sound travels strangely in ancient houses. However, something had been bugging me in the back of my mind since I had seen that Helen had started carrying what appeared to be huge Tupperware containers back to her room, and that her visits to the kitchen at midnight had increased. She had just smiled the same courteous grin and told me everything was okay when I casually asked if she needed more refrigerator space. The Yamamoto family arrived the following week and complained of a sweet, cloying odor that persisted and seemed to be thickest close to room 7. They said it smelled worse than flowers that had been in water for too long. After walking the hallway several times myself, I could only pick up the tiniest hint of what might have been an overripe fruit or possibly a stale air freshener. As more visitors rode their bikes through the inn, the complaints grew more intense. The Millers reported that their pricey shampoo, a bottle of prescription medication, and bathroom supplies had all disappeared overnight. Strange scratching noises were observed by the Kowalski couple from within room 6's walls, directly the room next to Helen's. Throughout their entire time, they heard sporadic sounds. The event with the Patels, who had reserved the room across the hall from Helen, was the most unsettling. On their checkout morning, Mr. Patel came up to me, very upset, and told me how his wife had seen a figure standing still in Helen's doorway at 4 a.m., spent what seemed like a lifetime watching their door before withdrawing back into the room an hour later when Mrs. Patel had gotten up to use the restroom. She had discovered damp footprints that led to the common bathroom down the hall from Helen's room. Even so, the prints were different. They resembled bare feet more than any typical shoe pattern, yet they were enlarged and in some ways incorrect. I was losing reservations by January. In tiny towns, word gets out quickly, and visitors began writing evaluations about the eerie atmosphere and upsetting disturbances. I kept coming up with reasons to leave Helen's door, even though I knew I had to confront the situation. The logical half of me kept telling me that the guaranteed rent money had become necessary to keep the inn open, and that she was just a harmless woman going through a tough moment. Even Helen, who had dropped a significant amount of weight and her skin had become nearly translucent, was courteous in our infrequent interactions. She tended to lick her lips often, as though they were always dry, and her voice had taken on a little rasp when she spoke. Most unnervingly, she had begun to inquire strangely about the other visitors' bedtimes, whether they were heavy sleepers, and whether they brought valuables on the trip. When I woke up at daybreak on a particularly chilly Wednesday in mid-January and discovered the cops outside my front door, it was the tipping point. I had known Officer Bradley Thompson since high school, and he seemed serious as he described how they had gotten numerous allegations of suspicious activity at the lodging. Mrs. Henderson apparently remembered more information about her visit and had contacted from Boston. She hadn't given it much attention at the time, but she had seen Helen in the parking lot one evening, standing next to a guest's car with what looked like a key. The Yamamotos had also got in touch with the police after learning that their credit card details had been stolen and that fraudulent payments had been made within days of checking out. Officer Thompson inquired as to whether I had observed anything out of the ordinary in Helen's conduct, and I understood how stupid I had been to overlook every warning sign as I stood there in my bathrobe, recounting months of odd experiences that I had tried to explain away. Following their departure, with assurances to come back later that day for a formal interview, I felt I had to face the situation right now. With my master key shaking in my hand, I ascended the stairs to the second floor. The delicious, rotten stench that the guests had complained about filled the corridor as I got closer to room 7, and it was now so strong that it made me cry. I called Helen's name and knocked gently, but got no answer. The quiet stretched in an unusual way. No footfall, no classical music, not even the sound of breathing. The fragrance hit me like a solid wall when I eventually turned the key and pushed the door open, making me cover my nose with my sleeve. With the exception of a few big plastic containers neatly packed in the corner, the room was utterly devoid of personal possessions, as though Helen had never been there. They were all labeled with dates from the previous 4 months and sealed with duct tape. I still have nightmares over what I found when I opened the first crate. I recognized dozens of driver's licenses, credit cards, and other belongings from past visitors within. The prescription bottle belonging to Mrs. Miller. Mr. Jewelry belonging to at least 6 different women who had been at the inn, including Kowalski's pricey watch. However, there was something much worse hidden beneath these pilfered possessions. Pictures, hundreds of photos of visitors sleeping, undressing, and taking a shower were captured via windows. Private moments that were secretly recorded. Names, room numbers, and what seemed to be private information Helen had somehow managed to compile about each victim were painstakingly written on each picture. There was much more unsettling evidence. In the second crate, copies of the guests' room keys, thorough notes about their daily habits, and what appeared to be credit card readers and other unfamiliar gadgets. However, it wasn't until the third container that I realized the actual horror of what had been taking on in my own home. Clothes, underwear, and personal belongings that could only have been removed from visitors while they were asleep were found inside, as were vials of what appeared to be hair and nail clippings, all arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail. I called Officer Thompson right away, trembling as I tried to describe what I had discovered. Detectives, forensic experts, and investigators crowded the inn within an hour, treating the entire second floor as if it were a crime scene. According to the inquiry, Helen Carpenter was actually Beverly Walsh, a woman with a long criminal background that included breaking and entering, stalking, and identity theft in several jurisdictions. Using my inn as a base of operations, she had been methodically harming each visitor, compiling enough personal data to steal their identities and sell their intimate images on dark web platforms. When they looked at the walls of room 7, they made the most horrifying discovery. She created a complex surveillance system by drilling tiny holes into the adjacent rooms, which enabled her to surreptitiously view and take pictures of visitors. The Kowalski couple had heard scratching noises, but they were not coming from within the walls. They were Beverly's footsteps passing through crawl spaces she had made, entering several rooms to set up cameras and take property when people were asleep. My business and sense of security suffered greatly as a result. 23 former visitors reported being victimized, and I was sued several times for not ensuring their safety and privacy. The needed to be fully I had to spend almost all of my savings on renovations to get rid of all of Beverly's changes. She was taken into custody 3 states away, found using my guests' credit cards that had been stolen, and given a 15-year term in jail. Not only does the betrayal of my guests' confidence bother me, but my own deliberate ignorance of the clear indications. I had put quick cash ahead of the security of individuals who had confided in me at their most vulnerable times, resting in what they thought was a safe area. 6 months after the Willow Browkin's permanent closure, I relocated, moved a tiny apartment in the city, yet I still occasionally wake up at night contemplating those pictures, wondering how many the same awful decision that I made has been made by other innkeepers, landlords, or property managers, making a financial decision, stability over acting morally when all of your instincts tell you that something is bad. After the police had packed up their equipment and the inn fell silent, the emptiness that took hold was suffocating. The once bustling halls where laughter and footsteps once danced were now hollow and cold, as if the building itself mourned. What had happened? I found myself wandering the second floor aimlessly, running my fingers along the chipped banister, my mind replaying every strange noise, every odd glance from Helen, or rather, Beverly. Room 7 stood at the end of the hall, a black hole of dread I dared not enter for days. When I finally summoned the courage, I noticed the countless tiny holes drilled into the walls, like the eyes of a malicious spider weaving its web. The thought of someone crawling through the narrow crawl spaces, moving silently between rooms, setting up cameras while my guests slept, sent a cold shiver down my spine. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, haunted by the faces of my guests, Mrs. Henderson's concerned eyes, the Yamamoto's polite smiles, the Kowalski's quiet whispers. None had any idea they were living among a predator. I imagined their most private moments, captured and sold, their lives violated in ways words couldn't fully express. I felt a crushing guilt, not only for what they endured, but for how I had ignored the signs, the complaints I brushed off, the odd smells I tried to rationalize, the noises I dismissed as quirks of an old building, all pieces of a sinister puzzle I had failed to see. The media swarmed once the story broke, painting me as the negligent innkeeper who had put profit before safety. Lawsuits followed from guests who felt betrayed, exploited, violated. My savings drained quickly as I poured every cent into extensive renovations, tearing down walls, replacing floors, installing new locks and modern security systems. But no amount of physical repair could erase the psychological damage. Even after the inn's permanent closure, the shadows followed me. In my new, modest apartment in the city, the silence was different, but no less oppressive. At times, I felt watched not by a person, but by memories and regrets that clung to me like a second skin. I'd catch myself jumping at the slightest creak or rustle, half expecting to see those cold, calculating eyes of Beverly lurking in a dark corner, waiting to strike again. I started having vivid nightmares. In them, The walls of the inn stretched endlessly, filled with unseen cameras, blinking red in the dark, capturing every moment of my life. I'd hear the faint hum of classical music drifting from an empty room, mixed with scratching noises and whispered threats. Each morning, I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, unsure if I was still dreaming or if some part of that nightmare was now reality. Friends and family urged me to move on, to let go of the past. But how could I? Every time I closed my eyes, the images returned, the crates filled with stolen belongings, the jars of hair and nail clippings, the meticulous notes of strangers' lives. I had unwittingly opened my doors to a monster. And the price was more than financial, it was a deep wound in my soul. Occasionally, I'd see news reports about other cases, innkeepers, landlords, Airbnb hosts discovering hidden cameras, all thefts, victims whose privacy was shattered just like mine. It was a sobering reminder that the same mistake I made was happening elsewhere, fueled by the same misplaced trust and desperate need for income. I began to wonder how many had been victims without ever knowing. How many had their lives quietly, torn apart by unseen eyes. The financial stability I so desperately chased now seemed hollow and meaningless. No amount of money could buy back the peace I lost or the innocence of trusting a stranger. I realized that when instinct warns us, when the smallest alarm bells ring, ignoring them is the greatest betrayal, not just to ourselves, but to those who depend on us. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering how many secrets the old inn still holds, how many others suffered in silence, and whether the darkness I fled has truly left me or if it waits patiently, ready to strike again, wherever I might hide. The weeks after the inn's closure blurred into a painful haze. I was caught between trying to rebuild my life and the relentless weight of guilt. Every morning, I forced myself out of bed, but the energy to smile or feel normal was nowhere to be found. I'd become a ghost drifting through my own days. The lawsuits were relentless. Former guests who once smiled politely at check-in now stared with suspicion and anger, demanding compensation for the violation of their privacy. I sat through endless depositions, each replaying the same harrowing story of hidden cameras, stolen identities, and shattered trust. The courtroom was a battleground where I fought not just for my reputation, but for some shred of justice for myself and my guests. My attorney told me to brace for the worst. Insurance wouldn't cover intentional crimes committed by a third party. The inn's value plummeted, and the mounting debts crushed any hope of reopening or moving forward financially. Friends slowly distanced themselves, unsure how to comfort someone engulfed in scandal and sorrow. But perhaps the hardest part was the silence that followed the unspoken stories behind each accusation. I knew there were victims whose lives were irrevocably changed, who now looked over their shoulders or wrestled with shame they didn't deserve. One evening, a letter arrived from a woman named Claire. She wrote with trembling hands, sharing her story in a way that brought a lump to my throat. She was one of Beverly's victims, a quiet librarian who had come to the inn for a weekend retreat, seeking rest from the world. Instead, she found herself under a cruel microscope. Claire described waking in the middle of the night to strange sounds outside her door, soft footsteps, muffled whispers, and the chilling sensation of being watched. The violation wasn't just physical, it was the erosion of safety, the loss of control over her own life. She ended her letter with a haunting plea. "I hope no one else has to feel this way." Her words hit me harder than any court ruling. They reminded me that beneath every case number and news headline was a real person grappling with fear and betrayal. Slowly, I began attending therapy, confronting the shadows that clung to me. It was painful, each session peeling back layers of shame, regret, and anger, but it was also a lifeline, a way to reclaim my narrative from the darkness. My therapist helped me understand that my mistakes, though costly, did not define me. Healing was possible, even if it was a long, uneven road. Meanwhile, the legal process dragged on, but there was a small victory when Beverly Walsh was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Knowing she was behind bars provided some solace, yet it did little to erase the scars left on my guests or on me. Occasionally, I heard from other innkeepers or landlords who had faced similar horrors. We shared stories in anonymous forums, offering advice, support, and warnings. Together, we vowed to never let desperation blind us again. One cold morning, as snow gently blanketed the city streets outside my apartment window, I finally felt a flicker of hope. I realized I could choose to honor the past not by being consumed by it, but by learning from it, growing stronger, and protecting those who came after. The memories of the Willowbrook Inn will never fully fade, but neither will the resolve to rebuild trust, to create safe spaces, and to listen when instinct whispers warnings we dare not ignore.